Thank you very much. I was delighted to receive the invitation to come here, surprised as well. I wouldn't consider I've been involved in some kind of church plants, but I wouldn't consider myself a church planter particularly. But I hope what I have to share is going to be useful for those of you that are involved in that. And I'm really pleased to be here and learning from you as well as sharing this. I'm grateful to Josh as well for that kind of warning of the sensitive nature of this. I was presenting some of this material to clergy on a Lent study day in my diocese in Bristol earlier this week. And someone came up to me afterwards and was like, thank you so much, that was really helpful. She was like, but I think we needed an even stronger trigger warning, because not just for those who may themselves have experienced trauma and abuse in different settings, but for just all of us, these are heavy things, aren't they? And the sense of anger, frustration, hurt that we can vicariously feel is real. And so again, please do take care of yourselves and one another. I'm assuming people know Soul Survivor. Is there anyone that doesn't and is just not familiar with? Great. I wonder if you're willing as well. Who here has been involved in Soul Survivor in their life and ministry? So a significant number of us. And before I begin, I will be reading the paper, but I hope I've written it in a way that is engaging. And I did some slides last night thinking that might also help, so I hope that they're useful as well. And it's been great to hear the other papers. I'm so grateful for the good news stories that we heard yesterday from Father Raphael and just now, and great stories that he was sharing with us of those case studies. This is kind of the opposite of those things. But as we've said, I think the importance of those being held together and building on what Professor Mobley was sharing around the complexities of our motivations and practices in our kind of attempting to be faithful following God. So let me just check the time. I first experienced the charismatic movement when I was 11 years old. That's me at the top, aged 11. This is the church I grew up in. I'm a cradle Anglican. This is St Edmund's Church in Allestree in Derby, if anyone knows it. Very traditional, middle of the road Anglican church, robed choir, sung Eucharist, etc. But at the age of 11, I went to the New Wine Conference in 1994, which that makes me 41 if you are wanting to do that. And this down here is a picture of New Wine. And the Toronto Blessings inspired dramatic manifestations of the Holy Spirit, which I encountered during that time for the first time, had a profound effect on my faith. And the charismatic movement is a tradition that has continued to nurture my spirituality and theology to this day. I attended many Soul Survivor summer conferences as a teenager. I was previously part of an HTB church graft in London. I attended several Willow Creek leadership conferences in the UK. I listened to Hillsong's worship and to online sermons by people like Ravi Zacharias and Mark Driscoll, among others. I am therefore very much an insider to network charismatic Christianity, and I have been deeply formed and shaped by its commitments. I also want to say that I also feel like an outsider as well as an insider. I haven't worked in any of these institutions. I was never invited to speak in them. I would attend these conferences. And so maybe that kind of insider-outsider status has enabled me to engage in the way that I am through the work that I've done in this kind of both appreciative and critical way. But because of this deep formation, I have been very impacted by the increasing number of reports into horrific abuse from within this network and associated evangelical groups. While myself not a victim of abuse within these networks, I am a survivor of abuse experienced within a secular working context. And so I have lived experience of trauma, which has informed my engagement with these reports. And so you'll see there the list of the reports. So the scolding report into Mike Pilavachi and their situation in Soul Survivor has obviously been very dominant, but the John Smythe report, the reports into Ravi Zacharias, Bill Hybels, as I mentioned, a very recent, the Firefly report into Mike Bickle of the International House of Prayer. Some of these names may well be very familiar to you. The report in Jonathan Fletcher, the Emmanuel Church in Wimbledon, And in addition to these reports, I've also been engaging with other more journalistic reporting on abusive church leaders, such as Carl Lentz of Hillsong, Mark Driscoll of Mars Hill, Todd Bentley of Fresh Fires Ministry. Significantly, for this context, I would consider that 6 of these examples would be classic church plants in their origin. And so I'm not engaging specifically with that dynamic. I'm looking at it more from the charismatic perspective, but there are things in there to be explored. I'm also not exploring the significance of gender, but you will notice that all of these are male. I tried to find reports on women who have been perpetrators of abuse within these contexts, and I couldn't find any. The reports I couldn't find. It doesn't mean that it doesn't happen. And again, I'm not exploring the gender dynamic, but there obviously is one here that does need further attention. Not least the fact that very few women lead in these kinds of church contexts could well be a cause for the significant gender imbalance that we see. But as I say, I'm not doing a gender critique particularly. These reports identify tragically repetitive behaviours across the different charismatic contexts, including an overly influential charismatic leader with inadequate oversight or line management who engage in bullying, intimidating and manipulative behaviour towards staff and congregation members. There's frequently evidence of unhealthy church cultures where dissent and questioning is silenced, where there is fear of reprisal over speaking out, and where the other leaders seem particularly motivated to protect the reputation of the ministry. The leader's misconduct is often explained or dismissed by others as, well, that's just what they're like. And there are, tragically, often forms of sexual misconduct detailed in the reports. The horrors of these reports, alongside their deeply disturbing repetitiveness, has caused me to examine whether my cherished charismatic theology is somehow creating the contexts within which these abusive practices are taking place. So within this paper, I want to draw on Winner's book, The Dangers of Christian Practice, which I'll talk about in a minute, to argue that, yes, there are specific ways in which charismatic theology is malforming people and communities in ways which enable abuse to take place. But crucially, Winner shows that all Christian practices malform us as well as form us. And therefore, theology fostering abuse is, as we know, sadly, not unique to charismatic contexts, as that some examples of reports from other traditions make clear. This isn't just a charismatic problem. But what I want to look at is the particular ways in which charismatic theology contributes to particular forms of abuse. Strangely, I want to argue that despite these serious challenges, my response is not to reject charismatic Christianity, but to seek the Spirit's renewal in and through the distinctive charismatic emphases. So I remain a charismatic, even having faced these very disturbing difficulties. In 2023, I wrote a book called Charismatic Christianity, that's part of the cover, which sought to advocate for the charisms or the gifts of charismatic Christianity among the wider church. And within this book, I identify 7 emphases which characterise the spirituality of charismatics and which describe a spiritual context within which the flourishing of the Spirit is possible. So I'm beginning with the giftedness of the tradition, which I still want to hold on to. And these are the 7 emphases that I outline in the book. Expectancy, just running through them very quickly, which is to expect a new thing that God is doing. We expect God to do stuff in ways that we can discern and give thanks for and recognise. Enchantment is to look for the miraculous inbreaking work of God in the world. Encounter describes the hope for a felt, embodied meeting with God. We feel our faith. Expression describes the practice of telling stories and giving testimony about God's encountered work. Equality celebrates that everyone participates in ministry by the gifting of the Holy Spirit. Empowerment looks for the Spirit to inspire courageous faith to enable mission and transformative mission and evangelism. And enjoyment means we expect faith to be fun and our future to be secure. In this book, I argue that these emphases are gifts to the historic mainline denominations. The church that I flagged up, that I grew up in, was often not expectant that God would do stuff. Enchantment was often quashed by a rationalism and a materialist worldview. Encounter with God wasn't especially sought, and there was no testimony to express. Equality manifested as a form of clericalism, and there was only a minimal sense of the empowering of the Spirit, and faith was often pretty boring, if I'm honest, and not very fun or enjoyable. And so these emphases become countercultural to some of the non-charismatic expressions of faith that we may have experienced. So there's both this giftedness, but also they can act counterculturally within the Western Church, but it's also clear from the literature on charismatic and Pentecostal movements that these emphases can also align with the norms and expectations of secular Western culture in problematic ways. For example, expectancy can become an obsession with the latest fashion or trend that we recognise in our wider culture. Enchantment can become a fixation with the spectacular. Encounter can become a form of emotionalism and therapeutic self-help. Expression can become a form of spin and marketing. Who can tell the best story? Equality can become a flattening homogeneity where we all just need to look and dress the same. Empowerment can become a form of manifesting self-empowerment, and enjoyment can become a form of hedonism. Thus, there's already a developed sense within the literature of the dangers and problems that these emphases can cause. So I'm trying to show giftedness and kind of and ways in which these emphases differ, are countercultural within Christianity more broadly, but also culturally laden in other problematic ways. But the academic discussions into some of these dangers don't engage with specific situations of abuse and the relationships between the emphases and the practices of abuse. I'm moving from emphases now into practices. I do this in the book through charismatic gifts, which I don't have time to go into, but show how each of these emphases are performed, the practices that perform those emphases, the way we know that we are expectant or have an enchanted view of the world is through these particular spiritual gifts. So prophecy particularly performs a sense of expectancy. Healing particularly performs a certain understanding of encounter with God, but you have to read the book to find out more about that. So in this paper, I want to get onto the ways in which the shadow side of my charismatic emphases may be contributing to the repeated abusive behaviours discussed in the reports, in order, hopefully, to suggest more flourishing ways that they might be employed. Lauren Winner's book has been particularly helpful for me in formulating this argument. She shows how all forms of Christian practice are deforming by nature, even when we practice them properly. So to engage in Christian prayer or Eucharist or baptism is always to participate in both formation towards Christ-likeness and deformation towards harm. This is because sinful humans in a world marred by sin will always harm as well as heal. Our practices don't solve the problem of sin. Only Christ's salvific work on the cross can do that. So even when we're attempting our most holy and sacred devotion, we are also engaging in practices of deformation. She shows how practicing the Eucharist often becomes the means by where the church sees itself as replacing the Jewish people in God's story of redemption. And she describes this supersessionism as Christianity's primary deformity. Likewise, she uses the example of the prayers of 18th century slave owners to show how Christian intercession became a vital means for sustaining the abhorrent social structures of slavery. And she shows how intercession becomes a means for people to attempt to assert their own will in a holy guise. For Winner, it's never just the case that we're performing practices wrongly, and if only we can find the correct way to perform our Christian faith, all will be well and everyone will flourish. Even our best intentions and our most holy actions will always hurt as well as help until Christ returns and renews all creation. Jesus seems to express this same sentiment parabolically when he talks about the wheat and the tares which grow together in Matthew 13, or the sheep and the goats existing alongside one another in Matthew 25. In each case, it is only at the eschaton that the good and bad are revealed for what they are and dealt with accordingly. Importantly, Winner's work helps us to recognise the complexities of this good and bad together, mixed motivations. How did it help as well as harm? Greg's case studies from yesterday, which were that profoundly encouraging story, I was left thinking, what if later on we found out that some forms of abuse were happening in that context? Does that automatically undo all of that seeming good? And similarly, all the stories we've heard, does it negate all of that good fruitfulness? Or does that become examples of the possibility of the wheat? Do we often fall into the temptation of thinking that the wheat can grow without the tares? So I now want to go through each of the 7 emphases in turn to show how their shadow sides, their deformities, can and do contribute to the possibility for an abusive church culture. And so first, expectancy. To expect God to do stuff is particularly the expectation that God is working through a gifted or gifted individuals. And the Bible teaches us to expect that God will do mighty things through flawed individuals. David, Gideon, Samson, Jonah, Miriam, Esther, Peter, Paul, John. Like these biblical characters, each of the leaders in the reports had a powerful, fruitful ministry, which was seen as evidence of God's blessing, and it caused people around them to seek their favour. The Scolding Report describes the cult of the charismatic leader, where Mike Pilavachi had the gift of youth leadership, and therefore was God's choice, it was interpreted to be God's choice to lead the ministry. This sense of the leader's unique gifting by God is very common through the reports. A Facebook post from the leadership panel denouncing Todd Bentley's ministry still noted, "We love Todd and believe that he has been supernaturally gifted by God." The reports on Bill Hybels and Mike Bickle note the high affection and respect with which they were regarded. The myth of homogeneity, which is, quote, the incorrect assumption that individuals who possess positive giftings and behaviours cannot behave in harmful and or abusive ways. And therefore, end quote, she says, followers choose not to see the flaws of the leaders. Contrary to Oakley, I wonder if it's less that people can't imagine gifted leaders behaving badly, and it's more that they've learned to expect that God will use flawed people for his purposes. And therefore, who are we to question the ways of God? Mike Pilavachi was frequently open about his personal struggles in his talks and sermons, but this often served to increase his authenticity as a flawed leader who God was using. Expectancy can lead us to expect that God will work through a gifted but flawed leader, and so we both elevate them and are quick to forgive them in equal measure. With enchantment, the emphasis focuses on both the Spirit's miraculous inbreaking and the devil's disruptive schemes, the misenchantment of the world. And it means that through the spiritual gifts, we elevate our friends and cast out our enemies. Within the reports, prophetic words were often given by the leaders that would have the effect of singling people out and making them feel chosen and important, functioning to tie the recipients and their career hopes closely to the gifted prophetic leader. Therefore, cultures of dependency were created through the emphasis on the leader's special enchantment. But on the other hand, spiritual discernment would be used to demonize critics. Ravi Zacharias described his critics as, quote, nasty people and lunatics who were engaged in satanic type slander and falsehood. end quote. Mark Driscoll frequently characterised his critics as enemies of Christ. Mike Bickle would assert, quote, anyone who criticises or exposes him must be an agent of Satan, end quote. And the soul survivor culture is frequently described in the report as defensive against attack. Therefore, an enchanted emphasis can both make followers more dependent on the leader's gifting and can be used to characterise critics as at war with God's purposes. Third encounter, a focus on relational affective encounter with God and other believers encourages us to see the church as intimate family, which can blur boundaries between relationships. For Bill Hybels, allegations of sexual misconduct made by female staff members occurred within the context of mentoring relationships that crossed standard boundaries of employment, where he spent an inordinate amount of time in and outside of work hours. The scolding report highlights the blurring of boundaries created by a strongly relational culture in a context where relational actually meant relationship with Mike Pilavachi, where he's described as the hub of a wheel with the spokes all connecting into him. Mike Bickle, quote, demonstrated a complete lack of boundaries inside and outside of his office, end quote, which enabled him to groom his victims. Jean Vanier's ministry was similarly highly relational, with an abusive blurring of boundaries. And so again, to reiterate, many of these things aren't just charismatic problems. However, delighting in informality, spontaneity, and relationality, which are key aspects of charismatic spirituality, breed informal structures that blur those boundaries and benefit those in power. You okay? Take a breath. Expression. Telling encouraging stories of what God is doing can become a form of controlling the narrative to protect the cherished ministry. The Macon report notes how people around John Smythe didn't report their concerns because they were, quote, protecting the reputation of the Owen network, and that the individuals involved, as well as avoiding further exposure to wider criticism. End quote. Similarly, the Oakley and Plant report identified how, quote, a number of participants spoke of a shame culture in Bible studies. This, in addition to the focus on sound, solid and orthodox theology, for some resulted in a pressure to get every answer right. End quote. And thus there was little room for questioning, difference, doubts or alternative narratives. Cosper's podcast on Mars Hill had an episode entitled Questioning the Origin Myth, which examines the stories Mark Driscoll repeatedly told about his conversion and calling, such that it became almost part of the church's liturgy. The episode examines how the identity of a church community can become overly defined by the stories of the founder and leader. This is very interesting for church plants. And leaders' interpretations of events become the canon which defines and sustains the organisation. Fifth, equality. Although charismatics emphasise that everyone gets to play, following John Wimber, in reality, this often looks like charismatic leaders investing in a certain type of leader to the exclusion of others. The Macon report highlights how John Smythe, who moved more towards a charismatic theology later in his ministry, focused on young men from public school to prepare them for roles of national influence. Mike Pilavachi was well known for raising up young leaders who were usually young, male, attractive, clean-cut and white. Bill Hybels would likewise single out men for special mentoring, and Mike Bickle would carefully select 18 to 19-year-old girls for his programme called Friends of the Bridegroom. This linking with equality, just as a side note, the logic of this is they are choosing to raise up leaders who aren't presently represented in the wider leadership team, and so that's where it fits with the logic of equality. They're targeting people who usually younger people who aren't always as represented. Each leader would promise special ministry opportunities to their favoured ones, which would create uneven relationships of gratitude and dependency. This repeated special favour to a certain type of person strongly undermines a theology of the priesthood of all believers, but it's often interpreted as the leader's prophetic ministry and action as they discern the gifting of their selected individuals. Empowerment. Universally, the leaders discussed in the reports, you won't be surprised to know, were those with significant personal, institutional, relational and spiritual power, making them kings within their organisations or, quote, a pope in his own parish. Carl Lentz of Hillsongs was described as, quote, presiding over a congregation in which he did as he pleased in a hierarchy where he seemingly answered to no one. End quote. Bill Hybels is described as capricious and authoritarian. Jonathan Fletcher is described as using manipulative, controlling or coercive behaviour and bullying. And Mike Bickle, quote, created an environment of control and exploitation where the victims were coerced into compliance and silence. Mike Pilavachi would cultivate intense relationships with young men, which would often end in him ghosting them, meaning to drop them without explanation. Many of the reports note the lack of power the trustees' boards had in being able to regulate or challenge their behaviour. Their status as God's gifted and anointed leader and the evident fruit of their ministry meant that even senior people did not feel able to challenge them. And seventh, enjoyment. The sense that faith is fun and the future secure means that organisations want to protect what they have by only working with or appointing people who share our values. A central tenet of the International House of Prayer, Kansas City, was, quote, to handle issues internally, avoiding involvement from law enforcement or external entities. This approach was deemed essential for the organisation's continued operation and longevity, end quote. It was noteworthy that John Smythe moved from the more conservative evangelical I never know how to say that one, he moved to the Stewards Trust under the guise of becoming more charismatic, and he was welcomed as one of us. The real reason for the move was because he was being barred from working in Irvine and was looking for new opportunities. The Scolding Report recommends that trustee bodies should include at least one outsider as a safeguard against the internal protectionism that allowed Mike Pilavachi's abusive situations to go unchallenged. The leaders and their followers expect to be able to enjoy God's blessing amid like-minded groups and believe they have to protect the ministry from the threat of outsiders, which can lead to a narrow, warped view of reality. And so to summarise my reading of these reports under the headings of my emphases, they consistently show abuse can thrive within my identified charismatic emphases in the following ways, where congregations expect God powerfully to use a gifted but flawed leader, where spiritual gifts can be used to elevate and demonise people according to the leader's agenda, where familial relationships lead to problematic blurring of boundaries, where storytelling is used to control, protect and manipulate, where certain types of people are selected for special treatment according to the leader's preferences, where spiritual empowerment is the dominant way to exercise authority, and where organisations can choose to work only with people who share their values. I'm going to just reframe each of them in a moment if I've got time, but just to pause and look at those, it can be easy to think, oh, well, we're not guilty of any of those, but I guess how many of us emphasise the giftedness of particular people alongside their flaws, or have been tempted to see critics as undermining the work that God is trying to do, or emphasise we're family here, or told lots of stories about who we are, or have selected certain types of people for leadership roles, or have used our own sense of call and vocation in particular ways. And how many people who don't share our values do we actually work with? So I want to encourage the self-reflection as well as recognising that these things aren't all equivalent. But so what do we do? Am I all right for time? I can't leave you without some kind of sense of hope. How does a charismatic church flourish in the wake of these reports? Is it a case of abandoning deeply cherished emphases to become more Catholic or become more Anglican in spirituality, to find less abusive emphases? While some, such as post-charismatics and ex-evangelicals, might wish this to be the case, the Jean Vanier, Peter Ball, Nolan reports, etc., show that church abuse, sadly, as I've said, is not only a charismatic evangelical phenomenon, and that abuse is perpetrated in the full range of settings and traditions. Moreover, simply abandoning old beliefs, emphases, and practices for new ones fails to wrestle adequately with Winner's key argument. Despite post-liberal insights that Christian practices will form believers into the countercultural of the kingdom if rightly performed, Winner argues that the deformities of Christian practice are intrinsic to those practices. They will always deform, however well we practice them. We are not searching for risk-free, pristine practices that will solve all problems. These do not exist. Combating abuse in churches means first recognizing that tragically abuse and harm will continue to be enacted, not all equally and in different forms, but until Christ returns. The first step in fighting abuse is to recognize that abuse and harm will continue to take place, and we're most at risk when we think abuse couldn't happen here. Abuse doesn't happen here. That's when we're most at risk. However, this doesn't mean we do nothing. As Christians, we continue diligently to do the work of the kingdom while always knowing that we will never build it or bring it to being by our own efforts. Only God can do that. But we labour anyway, our efforts serving primarily to bear witness to his sure return. There are some straightforward ways that we can make our churches less hospitable to certain types of abuse, but these practices need to be seen as an ongoing process of diligently labouring towards a goal that we will never achieve. And so I just, to conclude, I want to work through these suggestions using the same 7 emphases. With expectancy, I think charismatics need to learn to continue in their sense of expectancy, that while God does only use flawed people, and therefore leaders are never beyond reproach or suspicion, God's use of these individuals does not condone all their behaviour. The biblical narratives of leadership are not primarily trying to set up heroes of faith for us to emulate, but they're written to create a sense of disappointment and longing that only God can resolve by coming to be the good shepherd for his people. We need to both expect holiness in our leaders and point it out where it is absent, but we also need to expect failure in those same leaders, responding as appropriate in different ways when it inevitably occurs. We must hold an expectancy for godliness and sinfulness together, combining hope and realism, recognizing that, to quote Luther, we are simultaneously saints and sinners. With enchantment, we need to learn that in being enchanted, our interpretations are not always what we might think. This might mean having a healthy skepticism towards our friends, who might be bringing a temptation of Satan that we need to rebuke, as did Peter for Jesus in Matthew 16. And maybe we need to be open to welcoming our critics as potential prophets sent to call us into life, as did Paul for Peter in Galatians 2. This is not easy to do. It requires ongoing vulnerability and vigilance, and a humble dependence upon God's grace to guide us into truth. It requires us never to be satisfied with our answers or interpretations, as we affirm that we now only see through a mirror dimly, and thus we do not always recognise friend and foe adequately. We must channel an enchanted view of the world, which embraces the supernatural and the ordinary, and is aware that many things are often not what we first think. With Encounter, the reports are an invitation to delight in boundaries and formality within our shared life together. The church is a family. It is also a body, a bride, a vine, a temple, an assembly, a flock, a building, a city on a hill, a royal priesthood, a military unit. Likewise, God is a father. God is also a shepherd, a potter, a rock, a king, a fortress, a lion, a hen, a mother bear, and a consuming fire. This range of biblical metaphors offers more formal and structured ways to think about how the church might relate to God and to itself beyond only the familial and the relational. Rediscovering and revivifying some of these neglected metaphors could open up new ways to think about boundaries and structures within our relational life together. With expression, we need to learn to emphasize not just the good and successful, but also the painful, the failures, the difficulties, and the different. God does not need us to defend him, nor to make the gospel more attractive to outsiders. The scriptures give us a huge array of different genres for expressing our faith, including letters, stories, poems, songs, history, allegory, lament. They also give us the full range of emotional responses and experiences of a life with God, including joy, anger, despair, hope, longing, sadness, bitterness, envy, and love. We need to engage with the breadth of these expressive genres and emotions for our flourishing and to faithfully bear witness to God's superabundant life. With equality, we need to ensure that we're working with, talking with, and learning from a wide range of different people. Where are our ministry teams lopsided in age, demographics, race, background, spirituality, ability, and gender? If our churches are not yet as diverse as the heavenly city, where every tribe and nation and people and language are worshipping together around the throne of God, then we still have proactive work to do to be the church that God calls us to be. No one person can discern, mentor, and encourage every person's possible vocation. Therefore, there must be diverse leadership teams working together to disciple, nurture, and train diverse disciples for ministry in God's overwhelmingly diverse world. With empowerment, Oakley describes spiritual abuse as the misuse of power in the name of God. The challenge is that many people with institutional power do not feel powerful. And what counts as use or misuse is not clearly accepted across different contexts. The empowered triumphalist theology, which charismatic Christianity is often associated with, can have a more diminished theology of sin, weakness, failure, and brokenness. And a rediscovery of these aspects of our shared faith might help to moderate understandings of power. We heard a bit about that yesterday. Those ecologies of power. The fruits of the Spirit, kindness, gentleness, love, and patience, which we were also talking about yesterday, are the contexts within which the power of the Spirit is to be exercised. The fruits of the Spirit are the true barometers of the Spirit's presence. As a minimum, leaders need further training on understanding the power dynamics intrinsic to their role. They also need robust, ongoing, reflective opportunities which allow them to explore the ways that this power shifts and morphs at different life stages, which they cannot always see or feel. Such training and reflection may enable renewed engagement with the fruits of the Spirit as well as the gifts. And finally, with enjoyment, we need to let go of an obsession with people who share our values, and learn to delight in working with people who see the world differently from us. A recent trip that I took to South Sudan exposed me to a very different culture of hospitality, where the outsider/guest was treated with the utmost respect. Having a shared willingness to cross boundary, being both host and guest, learning to highly value the outsider, is a challenging but enriching experience which can help the Western Church to deepen its joy. Therefore, appointing to our boards, PCCs and leadership teams, people with different theologies, worldviews, life experiences and priorities would be a key way to broaden our horizons and hopefully experience renewed joy. So to summarise, in this paper I've argued that it is possible, I think, to remain authentically charismatic in the wake of the abuse reports by first recognising and wrestling with the shadow sides of our deeply cherished emphases. Only in seeing how our convictions can deform as well as form are we able to inhabit them appropriately. I've argued that charismatics should expect both holiness and failure, remain open to God's enchanting work coming in unfamiliar forms, celebrating boundaries as the guardrails of our encounters, finding ways to express the different and difficult, enacting equality through diverse ministry teams, exercising the power of the Spirit in tandem with the fruits of the Spirit, and learn to enjoy interacting with people who think differently from us. These will not guarantee congregational flourishing, since flourishing is not something which we make happen. Fullness of life is a gift given from Christ to his church. Our primary role is to become a more receptive place for that gift. And I hope that the re-examination and re-articulation of these 7 charismatic emphases begin to do some of that becoming work, such that the Spirit can blow where it will and bring the fullness of life that Christ promises.